When I told my husband not to invite his overly flirtatious boss to his 40th birthday party, he laughed in my face and said, "Are you jealous? She is my VIP guest." I stayed silent and let him mock me in front of everyone. But the moment his boss walked into the party and saw me, her face turned paper white, and then she started screaming in pure panic. My name is Zora. I am 34 years old. I spent the last 5 years letting my husband and his snobbish family believe I was just a lowly vegetable peddler who got lucky by marrying into their prestigious Atlanta circle. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever sat back and watched an arrogant man dig his own grave just so you could happily push him into it. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the smooth, sultry sound of a live jazz quartet echoed through our sprawling mansion in Buckhead. It was my husband Julian's 40th birthday, and he had transformed the entire ground floor of our home into a lavish showcase of his perceived wealth and status. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowded room with silver trays of seared scallops and caviar, while the most elite members of Atlanta's Black High Society mingled in our living room. There were politicians, mega-church pastors, and corporate directors everywhere you looked. I stood quietly near the massive marble kitchen island, slowly stirring the ice in my glass of aged bourbon. I was minding my own business, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when Julian suddenly marched toward me. His custom-tailored tuxedo hugged his frame perfectly, but his face was twisted into a smug and deeply irritated expression. He did not say a word to me at first. He simply slammed a thick piece of paper onto the marble countertop, sliding it hard until it hit the base of my drink. I glanced down at it. It was the final invoice from the luxury catering company he had hired for the night. The bold numbers at the very bottom read exactly $25,000. "Pay this right now," Zora Julian commanded. His voice was sharp and deliberately loud, clearly intended to draw the attention of a few nearby guests, who discreetly turned their heads to watch. "I am busy entertaining my investors and making sure this night is completely flawless. You need to handle this immediately." I picked up the invoice, running my thumb over the expensive textured paper, and looked back up at him. "Julian, you want me to pay a $25,000 bill for a party you insisted on throwing for yourself?" Julian let out a harsh, condescending laugh, shaking his head as if I were a child who could not grasp a basic concept. "Yes, Zora, I do. You work from home in your sweatpants all day dealing with dirt and vegetables like some glorified farmer's market cashier. Meanwhile, I am the director of innovations at a major financial firm. I am out there grinding, making moves, building our empire, and maintaining our social standing. I have a critical image to uphold in this city. These people in our house right now are my colleagues, my partners, the people who actually matter in the real world. Since you do not contribute anything of real financial value to this household, besides those boring spreadsheets you do for your little farm project, the absolute least you can do is cover the food. Consider it your mandatory contribution to my birthday." Before I could even formulate a response to his staggering audacity, the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive floral perfume hit my nose. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, stepped up beside Julian. She was dressed in an elaborate emerald gown, her signature pearls resting heavily on her neck. Beatrice carried herself like Southern royalty, constantly reminding everyone of her family's long-standing position in the prominent local church and their deep generational ties to the city's elite. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, her eyes lingering critically on my simple but elegant black silk slip dress. "Honestly, Zora," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom and fake pity, "is that really what you chose to wear to my son's milestone celebration? You look like you are going to a neighborhood block party, not a high society gathering. You always did lack refinement, no matter how hard we try to polish you." She took a delicate sip of her champagne, leaning closer to me so her words could cut even deeper. "I told Julian years ago that he should have married one of his sisters from the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, a woman with actual pedigree, a woman from our church family who understands the weight of our legacy and knows how to host people of our caliber. But my son has a bleeding heart. He took pity on a girl from the wrong side of South Atlanta. You should be down on your knees thanking God every single day that Julian rescued you from that ghetto and brought you into this lifestyle. You should be writing that $25,000 check with a massive smile on your face, just to show your gratitude for the roof he generously put over your head. I listened to her toxic words, feeling the familiar, exhausting sting of their united cruelty. For years, Julian and Beatrice had treated me like a charity case. They genuinely believed that my business, a massive organic agricultural logistics network that supplied fresh produce to major grocery chains across the entire country, was just a cute little hobby. I had deliberately kept the true scale of my wealth hidden, letting Julian handle the mortgage from his account, while I quietly built a multi-million-dollar corporate empire from my home office. Because of my silence, they felt completely entitled to degrade me at every turn. They loved the power dynamic of the successful corporate husband and the dependent, uncultured wife. Julian crossed his arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with his mother, basking in her relentless defense of him. "Do not embarrass me tonight, Zora," he warned, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "My boss is going to be here any minute. She is bringing a billionaire investor who is about to fund my new division with $10 million. This is the biggest night of my career. Do not stand here looking sullen and ghetto. Pay the caterers, fix your attitude, and try to act like you belong here for once." They stood there, a united front of arrogance and misplaced superiority, waiting for me to shrink away in shame. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my background, and meekly pay the bill to keep the peace. They expected the girl from South Atlanta to yield to their generational wealth facade, to swallow the humiliation just to remain in their sparkling orbit. But they had absolutely no idea who they were actually talking to. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the fiery liquid warm my throat. I looked at the $25,000 bill, then looked back at my husband's smug face. The time for hiding was officially over. The heavy mahogany front doors of our foyer swung open with a dramatic thud. The sudden rush of evening air swept through the room, making the crystal chandelier above us chime softly. Julian instantly dropped his aggressive posture. The smug sneer vanished from his face, replaced by the eager, desperate grin of a man trying to impress someone far above his pay grade. He practically shoved his shoulder into my collarbone, knocking me aside with enough force that my bourbon splashed over the rim of my glass and onto my bare wrist. He did not apologize. He did not even look back at me. He just smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo and hurried toward the entryway like an obedient lapdog. "Everyone," Julian announced, projecting his voice over the live jazz band to ensure the entire room heard him. "The guest of honor has finally arrived. Please welcome the youngest vice president at our investment firm, the woman who holds the keys to my new division, Chloe." I watched calmly as Chloe stepped into the light of the foyer. She was wearing a skin-tight crimson-red silk dress with a plunging neckline that dipped dangerously low, a choice of attire that was screamingly inappropriate for a corporate superior attending her subordinate's family birthday gathering. But Chloe clearly thrived on being the center of attention. She tossed her thick, perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and strutted into our home with the overwhelming entitlement of someone who believed she owned the very floorboards she walked on. Julian practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to greet her. He grabbed her hand and pressed a lingering, overly familiar kiss to her cheek. "You look absolutely incredible tonight," he murmured, his voice laced with a level of intimacy that made several of the nearby guests exchange uncomfortable glances. Chloe offered a coy, practiced laugh, resting her manicured hand flat against Julian's chest for a second too long. "I told you I would make a grand entrance, Julian," she purred. "And you know I always deliver, especially tonight. We have a lot to celebrate, do we not?" "We certainly do," Julian replied, his eyes tracing the curve of her dress, before he reluctantly turned back to the room. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, who had just spent the last 5 minutes tearing me apart for my lack of refinement, suddenly beamed with delight. She floated over to Chloe, grasping both of her hands warmly. Chloe, my dear Beatrice gushed. We are so utterly thrilled you could grace us with your presence. Julian speaks of your brilliance constantly. It is so refreshing to see a young, educated black woman commanding such power in the financial sector. You are exactly the kind of influence my son needs in his life. The hypocrisy in the room was so thick it was suffocating. I stood a few feet away, watching my husband and his mother fawn over this woman. Chloe soaked up the praise, exchanging a knowing, triumphant look with Julian, before her gaze lazily drifted across the room and landed on me. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as they took in my understated black slip dress and the lack of flashy diamonds on my neck. A cold, calculated smirk touched the corners of her bright red lips. She did not see a threat. She saw a target. Chloe closed the distance between us, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Julian followed closely behind her, making absolutely no effort to introduce me as his wife. "You must be the domestic help Julian mentioned," Chloe said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. She shrugged off her heavy white fur coat and practically threw it into my chest, forcing me to raise my arms to catch it before it hit the floor. "Be a sweetheart and hang this up in the coat room," she commanded, not breaking eye contact with me. "It is genuine mink, so ensure it does not touch anything damp. And while you are at it, fetch me a dirty martini. 3 olives extra cold and go light on the vermouth. Do not make me wait too long." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. A few guests standing nearby suddenly found their drinks very interesting, turning away to avoid witnessing the blatant disrespect. Julian stood right next to her, watching his boss treat his wife like a hired servant, and he did not say a single word to correct her. In fact, a faint smile played on his lips. He was enjoying this. He wanted me to be humiliated. I held the heavy fur coat in my arms, my face an emotionless mask, waiting for her to realize her supposed mistake. But Chloe was not finished. She adjusted the lapel of her crimson dress, deliberately drawing attention to the small glittering pin fastened to the fabric. It was the iconic pink and green ivy leaf of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. She tapped the badge with her perfectly manicured fingernail and let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "You know Julian," Chloe said, turning her attention back to my husband while gesturing vaguely in my direction. "This is exactly why I keep telling you that pedigree matters. At our firm, we only hire individuals who understand the bonds of true excellence. People who come from the right legacy, the right upbringing, the right sisterhoods. It is impossible to teach class to someone who was born without it. You can dress someone up, but if they come from the bottom, they will always have the mindset of the help." Julian chuckled, a rich, deep sound that made my blood run ice cold. "You are absolutely right, Chloe. Some people just lack the capacity for greatness. They do not understand what it takes to build an empire. They are only good for taking orders." He finally turned his gaze to me, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Well," he snapped, his voice sharp and authoritative, "did you not hear our VIP guest? Take the coat, go to the kitchen, and get her the drink. Stop standing there like a statue. You have a job to do tonight." They stood there waiting. Chloe with her chin tilted upward in ultimate superiority. Beatrice watching from the sidelines with a satisfied smirk, thrilled to see the girl from South Atlanta put in her proper place. And Julian, the man who had promised to love and protect me, actively participating in my public execution. They thought they had broken me. They thought this display of wealth, Greek letter elitism, and corporate power was enough to remind me of my insignificance. I looked at the heavy fur coat draped over my arms. I looked at the $25,000 catering invoice still resting on the marble counter. And then I looked directly into Chloe's condescending eyes. I did not fold the pristine white mink. I did not move toward the coat room. I simply opened my arms and stepped back. The luxurious fur plummeted, hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy, dead thud. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate circle of guests. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine shriek of horror, her manicured hands flying to her mouth. "That is a $30,000 custom piece," she screamed, completely abandoning her sultry professional facade. "Are you out of your mind? Pick that up right now." I did not bend down. Instead, I shifted my weight forward deliberately, placing the sharp heel of my black stiletto directly onto the center of the white mink. I maintained dead, unblinking eye contact with Chloe as I applied pressure. Julian lunged forward, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "Zora! Have you lost your absolute mind?" he hissed, grabbing my wrist. "You are going to pay for that coat. You are going to pay the caterers. You are going to apologize to my boss right now, or I swear to God I will pack your cheap bags myself and send you back to whatever rundown apartment complex you crawled out of." I calmly looked down at his hand wrapped around my wrist. "Take your hand off me, Julian," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, lethal authority that made him instantly freeze. He released his grip, stepping back as if he had been burned, though he tried to mask his retreat with a scoff of disgust. I turned my attention back to the marble kitchen island. I picked up the thick, textured paper of the $25,000 catering invoice. Julian sneered, crossing his arms over his custom tuxedo. "That is right," he commanded. "Pick it up. Do the one thing you are actually good for tonight. Go find my checkbook in the study and clear that balance before the catering manager makes a scene." I looked at the bold total printed at the bottom of the page. Then I looked at Beatrice, who was fanning herself dramatically as if my behavior was giving her palpitations. Finally, I looked at Julian. I smiled. It was not a smile of submission, nor was it a smile of apology. It was the cold, terrifying smile of a woman who had finally finished playing a game she was tired of winning. I gripped the top of the invoice with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed like a gunshot over the smooth jazz music. Julian's jaw dropped. Chloe stepped back, her eyes wide with shock. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, tearing the $25,000 demand into useless, jagged quarters. I opened my hands, letting the shredded pieces of paper flutter down like snow, landing directly on top of Chloe's ruined mink coat beneath my feet. Julian looked like he was going to have a stroke. "What is wrong with you?" he roared, no longer caring who heard him. That was the final invoice. "The catering manager is waiting for payment. You are intentionally sabotaging the biggest night of my career. Do you realize who is in this room? I am the one bringing in the real money. I am the one building a legacy. If you will not pay for the food you are standing here eating, I will pay for it myself. I do not need your little farm money." He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek, heavy black credit card. He slammed it onto the marble counter with a resounding clack. He tapped the metallic surface aggressively, looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "This is what real power looks like, Zora." Julian spat, puffing out his chest. "This is a limitless elite account. It is the reward for actual hard work, not playing in the dirt. I will pay the $25,000 right now, and then I am calling my lawyers in the morning. We are done. You are completely useless to me." I looked at the heavy black card resting on the marble. I knew that card intimately. I knew the exact account number, the expiration date, and the security code on the back. I knew it because I was the one who had authorized its creation. "Is that right?" I asked softly. "You are going to pay for this extravagant party using that specific black card." "Watch me," Julian snarled, grabbing his phone from his pocket to call the catering manager over. I reached into my own clutch and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my private banking application. I navigated to the secondary user management tab. Julian was too busy glaring at me to notice what I was doing. I stared at the name listed under the authorized users section. Julian Vanguard. Status active. Limit unrestricted. For 5 years, I had allowed him to swipe that card to fund his expensive suits, his lavish business lunches, his luxury car leases, and his desperate need to look wealthy in front of his peers. I let him pretend he was the king of the castle simply because I loved him and wanted him to feel secure. But staring at him now, standing shoulder to shoulder with a woman who had just treated me like trash, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating clarity. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Julian," I said, my thumb hovering directly over the digital toggle switch on my screen. "This party is over." I pressed the button. A split second later, a loud, obnoxious alarm blared from Julian's hand. His phone screen lit up with a high-priority alert, the harsh buzzing sound cutting through the ambient noise of the party. He frowned, looking down at his screen. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched Julian's face transition from arrogant irritation to complete and total bewilderment. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the screen as he read the notification. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth fell open and he desperately tapped the screen trying to clear the message, but the glaring red text remained. "Alert," I said aloud, reciting the exact automated message I knew was burning into his retinas. "Your elite account has been permanently locked by the primary account holder. All current and future transactions are declined. Please contact the primary account holder for further information." Julian looked up at me, his breathing suddenly shallow and panicked. He looked at the black card on the counter, then back at his phone, his brain short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible. He shook his head, a nervous, breathless chuckle escaping his throat. "This is a mistake. The bank made a mistake. There is a glitch in the system." "There is no glitch, Julian," I replied, sliding my phone back into my clutch. "You love to talk about power. You love to boast about the elite circles you run in. You just told everyone in this room that you are the one bringing in the real money. But the truth is, you do not even own the plastic in your own pocket." I stepped closer to him, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that only he, Chloe, and Beatrice could hear. "That black card is not a reward for your corporate grind. It is a supplementary card. It is a secondary account tied directly to my corporate trust. You have been funding your entire luxurious lifestyle with my money. And as of this exact second your free trial has expired, you are officially cut off." Julian stood frozen, his perfect world shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of his VIP guest. He had no money to pay the caterers. He had no money to pay for the champagne. He had no money to fund the fraudulent image he had sold to everyone in this room. He was entirely, devastatingly broke. And judging by the panicked, furious footsteps rapidly approaching us from the hallway, his nightmare was only just beginning. The heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather dress shoes against the hardwood floor cut through the tense silence that had fallen over the kitchen. The crowd parted instantly, murmuring in hushed tones as a tall, imposing figure strode through the sea of Atlanta's elite. He moved with an inherent aggressive sense of ownership, his posture radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only came from a lifetime of never being told no. It was Connor. He was Julian's brother-in-law, married to Julian's younger sister, Gabrielle. Connor was a wealthy, highly connected commercial real estate developer, and he never let anyone in the family forget it. He wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, his golden blonde hair perfectly slicked back, his tanned face set in a deep scowl of disapproval. He walked with long, deliberate strides, bypassing the whispering guests and marching directly into our standoff at the Marble Island. Connor did not even look at me when he first arrived. He placed a heavy protective hand on Julian's shoulder, acting as the ultimate shield for my panicked husband. "Is there a problem here?" Julian Connor asked. His voice was incredibly loud, projecting a booming, authoritative tone designed to immediately establish him as the smartest and most rational person in the room. I could hear a commotion from all the way across the hall. What exactly is going on? Before Julian could formulate a coherent sentence to explain that his credit cards were completely dead, Connor's gaze dropped to the floor. He saw the shredded pieces of the $25,000 catering invoice scattered across the marble tiles. He saw Chloe's priceless white mink coat lying crumpled and discarded near my black stiletto. Connor let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He pinched the bridge of his nose, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a deeply unruly toddler who had just thrown a tantrum in a grocery store. He finally turned his attention to me, his pale blue eyes practically glowing with condescension. Zora Connor began lowering his voice into a patronizing, overly calm register. "Let us all just take a collective breath. You need to lower your voice and step back. You are making an absolute spectacle of yourself, and it is entirely uncivilized." I had not raised my voice once. I had not yelled. I had barely spoken above a conversational volume, yet here was Connor instantly deploying the classic narrative of the angry, aggressive woman who needed to be pacified by a rational man. I stared at him, my face completely blank. Uncivilized, I repeated smoothly. That is an interesting choice of words, Connor. It is the accurate choice of words, Connor fired back, taking a step closer to me, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me. We are hosting a high society event. We have state senators in the living room. We have corporate executives enjoying their evening. And here you are, throwing coats on the floor and ripping up invoices like you are fighting in a neighborhood alleyway. You are embarrassing Julian in front of his superior, and frankly, you are embarrassing my wife's family. We do not behave like this in polite society, Zora. I know you did not grow up around this level of wealth, but you have been a part of this family long enough to learn basic decorum. Julian, who had been hyperventilating over his locked bank accounts just seconds prior, suddenly found his courage again. Standing safely behind Connor's broad shoulders, Julian nodded vigorously. Exactly. Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with newfound bravado. Tell her, Connor. She is acting completely unhinged. She refused to pay the caterers, and then she started disrespecting Chloe. She is trying to ruin my birthday because she is incredibly jealous of my success. Chloe, the VIP guest who was still fuming over her discarded mink, crossed her arms and glared at me. It is absolutely pathetic, she added, stepping closer to Connor for protection. I have never been treated with such hostility in my entire life. Your brother-in-law is right. She has no idea how to conduct herself around people of our caliber. Connor raised his hands, gesturing for Chloe and Julian to relax. Do not worry, Chloe, Connor said, offering her a slick, charismatic smile that he usually reserved for his wealthy investors. I apologize on behalf of the family. Julian is a brilliant man and a vital asset to your firm. Please do not let the erratic behavior of his wife reflect poorly on him. I will handle this situation personally. Connor turned back to me, his smile vanishing instantly. He leaned against the marble counter, invading my personal space. He exuded the textbook arrogance of a white savior who genuinely believed he was the pillar holding this entire black family together. He had always viewed Julian as his eager protege, and he viewed me as an unfortunate liability that Julian had picked up before making real money. Listen to me very carefully, Zora, Connor said, his tone shifting from patronizing to openly hostile. I am going to explain how the real world works, because clearly you do not understand finance or social obligations. Julian is the breadwinner. Julian is the one climbing the corporate ladder. Julian is the one networking with people who actually matter. Your little vegetable business might give you something to do during the day so you do not get bored, but it is not real money. He tapped his index finger sharply against the marble countertop to emphasize his point. When your husband asks you to handle a simple catering bill, you smile, you pull out the checkbook, and you pay it. You do not throw a fit. You do not try to publicly humiliate the man who elevated you from the absolute bottom of South Atlanta. You owe this man your entire lifestyle. You owe this family your current social standing. And instead of showing gratitude, you are standing here acting like a feral animal, trying to bite the hand that feeds you. I remained perfectly still. I did not cross my arms. I did not shift my weight. I just let him talk, letting him dig a hole so deep he would never be able to climb out of it. Are you quite finished, Connor? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Or do you have more financial advice for me? Connor scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You really have no idea how precarious your situation is, do you, Zora? You think because your name is on a marriage certificate that you are untouchable. You think you are entitled to stand in this mansion and dictate how things are going to go. He leaned in even closer, dropping his voice into a vicious, threatening whisper. Let me make something crystal clear for you. You need to fix your attitude tonight, or you will find yourself out on the street with absolutely nothing. Julian is a nice guy, but I am not. I am a businessman. And if you continue to threaten his career, I will personally ensure you are removed from this property. I tilted my head, studying his flushed, angry face. Removed from this property, I echoed. You are going to remove me from my own home. It is not your home, Zora. Connor sneered, a wicked, triumphant grin spreading across his face. That is exactly what you fail to understand. You do not own anything here. He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket, preparing to deliver what he clearly believed was the ultimate killing blow. Did you really think a mid-level financial director like Julian could afford a $4 million Buckhead estate on his own? Did you think the bank just handed him the keys because he had a nice smile? Julian came to me when he wanted to buy this house. He knew his credit was not strong enough to secure the jumbo loan he needed to impress you. So I stepped in. My real estate development firm underwrote the entire mortgage. My company holds the paper on this estate. I am the absolute only reason you are not still living in a cramped apartment right now. Connor swept his hand through the air, gesturing to the lavish kitchen, the crystal chandeliers, and the sprawling living room beyond. I own the debt on these walls. I own the ground you are standing on. Julian answers to me, and by extension, you answer to me. So I am going to tell you exactly what is going to happen next. You are going to pick up that coat. You are going to apologize to Chloe. You are going to go upstairs, pack a small bag, and you are going to leave this house so Julian can enjoy his birthday in peace. If you refuse, I will initiate foreclosure proceedings on this property first thing Monday morning. I will ruin Julian's credit just to get rid of you, and I will have the sheriff drag you out of here by your hair. Julian stood behind Connor, looking slightly pale but nodding along in agreement. He was willing to let his brother-in-law threaten to rip his home away just to win an argument against me. Beatrice stood nearby, practically glowing with pride at Connor's ruthless display of power. They all believed Connor held the ultimate trump card. They believed the threat of losing the mansion would finally bring me to my knees. I looked at Connor. I looked at the fierce, unwavering arrogance in his pale blue eyes. He genuinely thought he was a titan of industry, putting a naive woman in her place. He had absolutely no idea that I already knew exactly what he and Julian had done with the paperwork for this house. He had no idea that I had been waiting for this exact moment to let him hang himself with his own words. I turned on my heel, leaving Connor standing there with his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. Let them think his threat of foreclosure had paralyzed me. Let them believe the girl from South Atlanta was finally retreating into the shadows where they assumed she belonged. I navigated through the sea of guests, keeping my face a mask of absolute stone, and slipped into the dim, quiet corridor leading to the butler's pantry. I needed a glass of water. More importantly, I needed exactly 60 seconds in silence to align my next strike. The pantry was separated from the main hallway by a heavy, ornate wooden partition with carved slats that allowed me to see out without being seen. As I reached for a crystal tumbler, the heavy thud of hurried footsteps echoed from the hall. Julian's frantic voice hissed in the darkness, followed immediately by the sharp, angry click of Chloe's stilettos. They slipped into the alcove just on the other side of the partition, completely unaware that I was standing mere inches away, shrouded in the shadows. "You need to fix this right now, Julian," Chloe demanded, her voice losing all its sultry professional polish. Her tone was sharp and unhinged. "Your card declined in front of me. Your brother-in-law is out there making a public scene. And your deranged wife is embarrassing me in front of the most important investors in the city. You promised me this night would be flawless." Julian let out a desperate, placating sigh, the sound of a man rapidly losing control of his carefully constructed double life. "Chloe, please, you have to calm down. The card declining is just a bank glitch, I swear to you. I will have my assistant call the platinum desk first thing in the morning and scream at them. And as for Zora, do not give her another thought. She is throwing a tantrum because she knows her time is up." I stood perfectly still in the dark pantry, the cold crystal tumbler pressed against my palm. I stopped breathing, straining to hear every single word. "You cannot let her stress me out like this, Julian," Chloe whined, her voice suddenly dropping into a sickeningly sweet, manipulative pitch. "It is not good for my blood pressure. Dr. Evans said I need to stay completely relaxed. Our baby deserves better than this chaos. I am not going to raise our child in an environment where your ex-wife is still lurking around, ruining our reputation." The glass in my hand nearly slipped through my fingers. A baby. 5 years of Julian telling me he was not quite ready for a family. 5 years of enduring Beatrice's snide, persistent remarks about my barren womb at every holiday dinner. And here he was, gently rubbing the stomach of his corporate superior, promising to build a future for their unborn child. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood just to keep from laughing out loud. Julian was comforting a woman pregnant with a child he physically could not have created. I had the medical files locked in my personal safe upstairs, documents verifying his absolute irreversible sterility. For years I had kept his medical secret hidden to protect his fragile masculine ego, allowing his family to blame me for our lack of children. He was literally plotting to throw me away to play house with another man's baby. The sheer spectacular irony of his betrayal was almost intoxicating. "I know, baby, I know," Julian murmured, his voice thick with false devotion. "I promise you she is gone tonight. I have the quitclaim deed sitting on my desk in the study right now. As soon as the last guest leaves, I am going to tell her that Connor is forcing a restructuring of the loan because of her little stunt with the caterers tonight. She is incredibly naive when it comes to finance. She will sign the transfer without even reading it if she thinks it will save her precious house. The second her signature is on that paper, I am changing the alarm codes and throwing her cheap luggage out onto the lawn. You will be moving your things into the master suite by tomorrow morning." Chloe let out a soft, satisfied hum, but her anxiety quickly returned. "What about the $10 million buy-in for my investment fund? If your bank accounts are locked right now, how are you finalizing the wire transfer tomorrow? My board of directors is expecting your capital injection by noon. If you do not deliver the money, you do not get the partnership, Julian." Julian let out a low, arrogant chuckle. It was the exact sound he made whenever he believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. "Do not worry about the bank glitch, Chloe. I already have the liquid capital secured in a separate holding account. Connor and I took care of it weeks ago." I leaned closer to the wooden slats, pulling my phone from my clutch and silently pressing the record button. "I told you Connor holds the mortgage on this house," Julian boasted, his ego swelling with every word. "But what Zora does not know is how we structured the debt. Connor had his internal appraiser completely forge the valuation on this estate. We artificially inflated the property value by nearly $3 million on paper. We pushed through a ghost cash-out refinance under Connor's real estate firm, and we drained all that fabricated equity straight into an offshore shell account. That is the money I am using to buy my partner shares in your fund." He laughed again, a dark, conspiratorial sound. "Zora has absolutely no idea she is currently living in a house that is essentially a hollowed-out financial grave. By the time I kick her out tonight, she will be walking away from a property drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt. Connor holds the fake paper, and we hold the cash. It is the perfect crime. We are going to be untouchable, Chloe." The recording continued to run on my phone, capturing the muffled sounds of Julian kissing Chloe's forehead, promising her the world while standing in the hallway of a house he had just confessed to robbing. The sheer magnitude of their stupidity washed over me in freezing waves. Julian and Connor, two men who believed their white-collar status made them invincible, had just committed federal mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and corporate conspiracy. They had executed this entire elaborate illegal scheme under the absolute assumption that Julian was the sole legal owner of the property simply because he was the one paying the monthly bills. They had no idea that the deed to this Buckhead mansion was not in Julian's name. It was not even in my name. The deed was locked tight inside an irrevocable trust established by my late grandfather, an untouchable legal fortress managed by my corporate attorneys. Connor did not hold the paper on my house. Connor held a forged, completely worthless document that he had illegally underwritten through his own firm. Julian had not drained the equity out of my home. He had stolen $3 million directly from Connor's investors. They had handed me the matches, doused themselves in gasoline, and were practically begging me to light the fire. I stopped the recording on my phone, securely uploading the audio file directly to my cloud server. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold reality of my power settle into my bones. Julian thought he was walking back into the party as a conquering king. He thought he was going to evict me from my own home and replace me with a woman carrying a stranger's child. I set my crystal tumbler down on the pantry counter. It was time to step out of the shadows. It was time to let the VIP guest meet the real owner of the house. I pushed past the carved wooden partition, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. Julian and Chloe jumped violently, pulling away from each other. Julian's eyes darted to the crystal tumbler in my hand, then to my face, panic instantly replacing his arrogant smirk. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin whatever desperate lie he had ready, but I did not even look at him. I walked straight past them, making my way back into the glaring lights of the main kitchen. Connor was still leaning against the marble island, holding a fresh glass of bourbon, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Beatrice was standing beside him, nodding along to whatever condescending remark he had just made. The crowd of guests had thinned slightly, giving our area a wide berth, though everyone was still watching intensely from the periphery. I stopped directly across from Connor. I opened my clutch and bypassed my phone, reaching into the hidden zippered pocket. My fingers wrapped around a thick folded piece of paper I had retrieved from Julian's home office safe 2 days ago. I pulled it out and tossed it onto the marble island. It landed with a soft slap right beside the shredded catering invoice and the heavy black credit card that had just humiliated my husband. Connor frowned, looking down at the document. "What is this, Zora?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock exhaustion. "Another bill you cannot afford to pay. It is a copy of the power of attorney you and Julian filed last month," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet kitchen. "The one you used to authorize a $3 million cash-out refinance on this estate through your commercial development firm. The one bearing my signature." Julian rushed into the kitchen, Chloe trailing closely behind him. Julian looked at the paper on the counter, and the last remnants of color drained from his face. Connor scoffed, picking up the document. He barely glanced at it before tossing it back down onto the marble. "You are my brother-in-law's wife. Julian manages the household finances. It is standard community property procedure. If you are upset about how Julian leverages his assets, take it up with him in couples counseling. Do not bring your domestic squabbles to my firm." "You are a real estate developer, Connor," I said, maintaining my icy composure. "You pride yourself on your meticulous attention to detail. You underwrote a multi-million-dollar loan, approved a ghost appraisal, and wired the funds to an offshore shell account, all based on this single sheet of paper. Did you ever actually verify who holds the deed to this house?" Connor rolled his eyes, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "Julian holds the deed. I saw the title search myself." "No, Julian provided you with a title search he paid someone to alter," I corrected. "If you had done your own due diligence, if your monumental arrogance had not blinded you to standard legal procedure, you would have discovered a very uncomfortable truth." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the marble, staring directly into his pale, condescending eyes. "This house is not community property. It is not in Julian's name, and it is not even in my name. This estate is the sole property of the Vanguard Irrevocable Trust, established by my late grandfather." The silence in the kitchen became absolute. The live jazz band in the living room had stopped playing. The only sound was the faint clinking of ice in someone's glass across the room. Connor froze the bourbon halfway to his mouth. His jaw tightened. "That is impossible. Julian brought me the paperwork. He brought me your signed authorization." "I did not sign anything," I stated firmly. "Julian forged my signature. And even if I had signed it, the document would be entirely legally void. I am simply a beneficiary of the trust. I do not have the legal authority to borrow against this asset, and neither does Julian. The only people who can authorize a lien on this property are the 3 corporate trustees sitting in a boardroom in Manhattan. You bypassed them completely." Connor swallowed hard. His arrogant savior-like posture began to crumble. He looked at Julian, who was currently staring at the floor, sweating profusely, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "You are lying," Connor snapped. His voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin, reedy, laced with a sudden, creeping terror. "Check public records right now," I offered, gesturing to his phone. "Pull up the county registry. You will see the Vanguard Irrevocable Trust listed as the sole owner since the day this house was purchased." Connor frantically pulled his phone from his suit pocket. His thumbs shook as he navigated the screen. Beatrice, realizing the severity of the situation, clamped a hand over her mouth. Chloe took a deliberate step away from Julian, her eyes wide as she began calculating the devastating risk to her own career. "Do you understand what you have done, Connor?" I asked, letting my voice ring out for every state senator and corporate executive in the room to hear. "You conspired with your brother-in-law to falsify a property appraisal. You accepted a forged power of attorney. You utilized your firm's capital to issue an unauthorized loan against a legally protected trust, and you wired those funds into a shell account to hide the transaction." I watched the blood rush out of Connor's face, leaving his tan skin a sickly, ashen gray. He looked up from his phone, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He had seen the registry. He knew I was telling the truth. "That is not just a breach of fiduciary duty," I continued, driving the point home. "That is federal mortgage fraud. That is wire fraud. That is corporate conspiracy. You did not save this family, Connor. You just handed the federal government everything they need to dismantle your entire real estate firm and strip you of your licenses." Connor stumbled backward, his hip hitting the edge of the stainless steel refrigerator. He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "You told me it was clean. You told me you owned the house free and clear." "I did not know," Julian cried out, his voice cracking with hysteria. "She told me it was our house. She handed me the keys after we got married. I assumed the deed was in my name." "You assumed," Connor roared, losing every ounce of his refined, wealthy composure. "You forged a legal document on a trust property. You just implicated my entire company in a federal crime because you wanted to play venture capitalist with a woman you are sleeping with." Beatrice gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she might faint. Chloe's face turned scarlet as intense whispers erupted around the room. The secret was out. Julian's carefully manicured life was imploding spectacularly, taking his wealthy, arrogant brother-in-law down with him. I stood tall, absorbing the absolute chaos I had just unleashed. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my sanity. Now they were staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Connor stared at the document on the marble island as if it had suddenly caught fire. His pale blue eyes darted back and forth across the legally binding seals and the undeniable signature of the corporate trustee. The heavy, booming authority he had weaponized just moments ago evaporated into the cold, sterile air of the kitchen. He began to pace the length of the marble floor, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. He ran his hands through his perfectly slicked back hair, ruining the expensive styling. "A trust," Connor muttered, his voice trembling. "You put the deed in a trust." He stopped pacing and lunged at Julian, grabbing him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo. "You told me the title search came back clear. You swore to me you held the deed to this property." Julian shrank back, raising his hands in a desperate defensive gesture. "Connor, I swear I did not know. She gave me the keys after the wedding. I am the one who pays the property taxes. I assumed it was under my name." "Paying the taxes does not give you the title, you absolute idiot," Connor roared, shoving Julian backwards so hard he slammed into the stainless steel refrigerator. "My firm processed a $3 million ghost loan based on a forged power of attorney. My personal signature is on the transfer authorization. The Securities and Exchange Commission is going to dismantle my entire company by Tuesday morning. I am facing 10 to 20 years in federal prison because you wanted to play venture capitalist with a woman you are sleeping with." Connor whipped around to face me, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. "Zora, listen to me," he pleaded, taking a step forward with his hands raised in surrender. "We can fix this. I can reverse the wire transfer. I can pull the funds back from the offshore shell account before the federal regulators flag the transaction. We can tear up the loan documents. It will be like it never happened." I looked at him with absolute zero sympathy. "You do not get to put the money back just because you realize the vault was rigged, Connor. You committed the fraud. You will face the consequences." Julian, seeing his powerful, untouchable brother-in-law reduced to a begging, terrified mess, realized he was rapidly losing control of the narrative. The surrounding guests were whispering, pointing, and recording the entire exchange on their phones. Chloe was glaring at him, her eyes narrowing as she mentally calculated the risk to her own career. Julian needed a lifeline. He needed to reassert his dominance not just to save face, but to convince himself that he was still the king of the castle. Julian aggressively straightened his tuxedo jacket and let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a hollow, desperate sound that echoed awkwardly through the high ceilings of the kitchen. "Fine," Julian announced, puffing out his chest and lifting his chin. "Keep the house, Zora. Keep your grandfather's archaic little trust fund. You think keeping $3 million out of my hands is going to ruin me? You think I actually need this dusty old property to build my empire?" He walked over to Chloe, wrapping his arm securely around her waist. He looked at me with a smirk of pure, unhinged delusion. "Tell her, Chloe," Julian commanded, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Tell my pathetic soon-to-be ex-wife about the real money. Tell her why we do not need a single dime of her fake equity." Chloe immediately straightened her posture, adjusting the neckline of her crimson silk dress. She recognized the pivot and smoothly stepped back into her role as the high-powered corporate executive. She shot me a look of profound pity. "Julian is absolutely right," Chloe declared, her voice projecting clearly to the remaining guests. "The $3 million from this house was simply a minor buy-in. It was a good-faith deposit to show my firm that he was serious, but the actual capital is coming straight from the top. My superior, the primary silent investor of the Apex Fund, has personally reviewed Julian's portfolio. The big boss is directly backing Julian's new division. $10 million in clean, legitimate venture capital is being wired into our joint corporate account tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Julian beamed, his chest swelling with ultimate triumph. "Did you hear that, Zora? $10 million. I am becoming a managing partner at the most ruthless investment firm in Atlanta. We are going to buy an estate 3 times the size of this one. You thought you could trap me with a mortgage stunt, but you just set me free. I am stepping into a completely different stratosphere of wealth, and you are going to be left behind with nothing but a crumbling house." The magic words had been spoken. $10 million. That staggering figure acted like a powerful narcotic on Julian's parents. Beatrice, who had been clutching her pearls in silent horror during Connor's meltdown, suddenly found her voice. The undeniable promise of extreme wealth instantly erased the reality that her son had just committed federal wire fraud. It erased the fact that he was publicly flaunting his pregnant mistress. In Beatrice's eyes, $10 million absolved Julian of every single sin. Beatrice stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, her husband, Reverend Thomas, marching right beside her. "I always knew you were nothing but a vindictive, small-minded girl." Beatrice spat, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You have been an absolute anchor around my son's neck since the day he met you. You tried to trap him in this dusty house. You tried to clip his wings because you knew you could never rise to his level. You are just a bitter, jealous woman throwing a tantrum because a real man finally outgrew you." Reverend Thomas nodded solemnly, clasping his hands together and utilizing his deepest, most pious preaching voice. He looked at me with profound performative disappointment. "The Lord removes obstacles from the paths of the righteous, Zora," Reverend Thomas proclaimed, his voice booming with hypocritical authority. "You are an obstacle. You stand here filled with spite and malice, trying to destroy my son's reputation simply because he is destined for greatness. Julian is joining forces with a woman of true pedigree and corporate power." The Reverend gestured toward Chloe as if she were a virtuous saint rather than a woman actively destroying a marriage. "Chloe understands what it takes to build a legacy. You only know how to tear things down. It is time for you to pack your belongings and vacate the premises. You do not belong in Julian's bright future." Beatrice scoffed loudly, stepping closer to her son. "She does not belong anywhere near our family. Julian, darling, call security right now. Have them escort this bitter woman off the property. She can take her little trust documents and go back to whatever pathetic, miserable life she was living before you generously rescued her from obscurity." Connor was still hyperventilating in the corner, furiously dialing his legal team on his cell phone, completely ignored by the Vanguard family. They were entirely blinded by the glittering illusion of the Apex Fund. They were so intoxicated by the idea of Julian becoming a multimillionaire that they had completely detached from reality. Julian looked at me, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. "You heard my parents, Zora. The game is over. Tomorrow morning I become a $10 million partner. So go upstairs, pack whatever cheap clothes you brought into this marriage, and get out of my house. You are officially evicted from my life." I stood motionless in the center of the kitchen. I let their insults wash over me. I let Beatrice call me small-minded. I let the Reverend call me an obstacle. I let Julian bask in his grand delusion of corporate supremacy. They had built a towering glass castle in their minds entirely constructed upon the foundation of the Apex Fund. They had absolutely no idea who actually owned that foundation. They believed the silent investor, the mysterious big boss of the Apex Fund, was an untouchable titan of industry operating from the shadows. They believed this faceless billionaire was going to hand Julian $10 million and elevate him to the highest echelons of Atlanta society. I looked at Julian's smug face, then at Chloe's triumphant smirk. I reached into my clutch once more. I pulled my phone from the silk lining of my clutch, my thumb resting lightly on the cool glass screen. Julian was still practically vibrating with arrogant energy, his chest puffed out as he looked down his nose at me. He was completely intoxicated by the fantasy of his impending financial salvation. To him, the imaginary influx of cash was a magic eraser, an instant cure for his crimes, his infidelity, and his spectacular failure as a decent human being. "You see," Zora, Julian gloated, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought you could back me into a corner with this little trust fund revelation. You thought cutting off a credit card would ruin me. But you do not understand how real power works. I do not need your house. I do not need your money. Because my future is secured by someone who actually operates on my level." He gestured grandly toward the hallway, just as the heavy rhythmic click of stilettos echoed against the marble. The visual focus of the room snapped rapidly from Julian's flushed, arrogant face, straight to the grand entryway. The transition was sharp and jarring. The ambient lighting in the room shifted instantly. I tapped a hidden command on my smart home application, and the massive tiered crystal chandelier suspended above the grand foyer flared to life. It flooded the entryway with a blinding, pristine white light cutting through the dim, moody party atmosphere like a blade. Chloe stepped out from the powder room corridor and into the edge of the foyer. She had taken a moment to reapply her bright red lipstick and smooth the fabric of her crimson dress. She stood tall beside Julian, projecting the image of a flawless corporate power couple ready to receive royalty. She held her phone tightly in her grip, her eyes fixed on the illuminated screen. She was waiting for the notification. She was waiting for the confirmation from the shadow investor that the $10 million wire transfer had been officially authorized for the morning. Julian wrapped his arm securely around Chloe's waist, presenting her to the room. "Chloe's superior, the primary silent investor of the Apex Fund, is arriving right now," Julian announced, his voice booming with unearned triumph. "The big boss has personally reviewed my portfolio and is directly backing my new division. $10 million in clean, legitimate venture capital is being wired into our joint corporate account tomorrow. I am becoming a managing partner. We are stepping into a completely different stratosphere of wealth, and you, Zora, are going to be left behind with nothing but a dusty house you cannot even afford to furnish properly." The magic words had been spoken, $10 million. That staggering figure acted like a powerful narcotic on Julian's parents. Beatrice, who had been clutching her pearls in silent horror during Connor's legal meltdown, suddenly found her voice. The undeniable promise of extreme wealth instantly erased the reality that her son had just committed federal wire fraud. It erased the fact that he was publicly flaunting his pregnant mistress. In Beatrice's eyes, $10 million absolved Julian of every single sin. Beatrice stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, her husband, Reverend Thomas, marching right beside her. "I always knew you were nothing but a vindictive, small-minded girl," Beatrice spat, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You have been an absolute anchor around my son's neck since the day he met you. You tried to trap him in this house. You tried to clip his wings because you knew you could never rise to his level. You are just a bitter, barren woman throwing a tantrum because a real man finally outgrew you." Reverend Thomas nodded solemnly, clasping his hands together and utilizing his deepest, most pious preaching voice. He looked at me with profound performative disappointment. "The Lord removes obstacles from the paths of the righteous." Zora, Reverend Thomas proclaimed, his voice booming with hypocritical authority. You are an obstacle. You stand here filled with spite and malice, trying to destroy my son's reputation simply because he is destined for greatness. Julian is joining forces with a woman of true pedigree and corporate power. The Reverend gestured toward Chloe as if she were a virtuous saint rather than a woman actively destroying a marriage. Chloe understands what it takes to build a legacy. You only know how to tear things down. It is time for you to pack your cheap belongings and vacate the premises. You need to roll up your bags and get out of my son's brilliant life. You do not belong in Julian's bright future. Beatrice scoffed loudly, stepping closer to her son. She does not belong anywhere near our family. Julian, darling, call security right now. Have them escort this bitter woman off the property. She can take her little trust documents and go back to whatever pathetic, miserable life she was living before you generously rescued her from obscurity. Julian looked at me, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. You heard my parents, Zora. The game is over. Tomorrow morning I become a $10 million partner, so go upstairs, pack your bags, and get out of my house. You are officially evicted. I stood motionless in the center of the kitchen. I let their insults wash over me. I let Beatrice call me small-minded. I let the Reverend call me an obstacle. I let Julian bask in his grand delusion of corporate supremacy. They had built a towering glass castle in their minds, entirely constructed upon the foundation of the Apex Fund. They believed the silent investor, the mysterious big boss, was an untouchable titan of industry, operating from the shadows, ready to hand Julian the world. I stepped out of the periphery, my heels clicking with slow, rhythmic precision against the marble, and walked directly into the center of the blinding light beneath the chandelier. I traded my clutch to my left hand and picked up a fresh glass of dark red wine from a nearby tray with my right. I stood exactly where the master of the house was meant to stand when receiving honored guests. "Where is he?" Chloe whispered to Julian, her voice laced with a sudden, desperate anxiety. He messaged me that he was already on the premises. He said he was stepping into the light to make the final introduction. Julian frowned, craning his neck to look past me, searching the empty hallway and the open front doors. "I do not see anyone," he muttered, his confidence slightly faltering. "Are you sure he sent the message to the right location? Check the secure portal again." Chloe looked down at her screen, her manicured thumb refreshing the application. As she did, her gaze swept upward, filled with frustration, and accidentally collided with mine. She froze. I stood perfectly still under the chandelier, holding my glass of wine, staring back at her with a look of absolute chilling calm. I did not break eye contact. I slowly raised my phone, ensuring the screen was facing her, and tapped the send button on a pre-drafted message. A fraction of a second later, the device in Chloe's hand chimed loudly. The sound echoed in the quiet foyer. Chloe gasped, her eyes darting from my face down to her glowing screen. She read the notification. Then she looked back up at me. Then she looked back down at the screen. The color drained from her face so completely that her bright red lipstick suddenly looked like a garish wound. Julian peered over her shoulder, trying to read the message. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice thick with impatience. "Did he authorize the transfer? Is the money cleared? Tell me he cleared the money, Chloe." Chloe could not speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she nearly dropped her phone onto the marble floor. She took a slow, horrified step away from Julian, her eyes locked entirely on me. The message she had just received on her highly encrypted, ultra-secure executive portal was a single devastating sentence. It read, "The Apex Fund does not reward thieves, and it certainly does not finance the men sleeping with its managing directors." Julian grabbed Chloe's arm, shaking her slightly. "Chloe, answer me. What did the boss say? We need that $10 million to close the loop with Connor. We need that money right now." Chloe slowly raised a shaking finger, pointing directly at me. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She was looking at the woman she had ordered to fetch her a dirty martini just an hour ago. She was looking at the woman she had called the domestic help. Julian followed her pointing finger. His brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. He looked at me standing under the chandelier, sipping my wine, entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding around me. "Why are you pointing at Zora?" Julian snapped, his frustration boiling over. Stop looking at her. She is irrelevant. I told you she is leaving tonight. Where is the investor? She is the investor, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child. Julian blinked. The words hit him, but they did not penetrate his thick skull. What are you talking about? Zora sells organic vegetables to local restaurants. She is a hobbyist. She is not an investor. Chloe finally found her voice, though it was shrill and laced with absolute panic. Julian looked at her phone. Look at the administrative clearance code on the message. It matches the primary server. She is the silent partner. She is the founder of the Apex Fund. Julian let out a loud, incredulous bark of laughter, rejecting the information completely. That is literally impossible, he declared, taking a step toward me. Zora, stop playing whatever stupid game this is. You hacked her phone. You somehow got into her portal just to ruin my deal. This is exactly why my mother hates you. You are a vindictive, miserable woman trying to destroy my life because you know you cannot survive without me. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich, full-bodied flavor. I lowered the glass and offered Julian a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. Survive without you, Julian? I asked softly, my voice carrying an effortless authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. You have not paid a single real bill in 5 years. You drive a car leased under my holding company. You wear suits paid for by an account I monitor. You are standing in a house owned by my grandfather's trust. You have spent our entire marriage playing the role of a wealthy corporate king, completely unaware that you were doing it on my stage, using my props and spending my money. Julian shook his head, his face contorting into a mask of pure denial. You are lying. You are a community college graduate from the South Side. You do not have $10 million to inject into a venture capital fund. I do not have $10 million, Julian, I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. The Apex Fund currently manages over $800 million in diversified assets. I built it from the ground up, right after my grandfather left me the initial seed capital. I kept my name off the public registry to avoid the exact kind of parasitic, opportunistic leeches that are currently standing in my foyer. Leeches like your brother-in-law, leeches like your ambitious little girlfriend, and leeches like you. Beatrice let out a high-pitched wail, her knees buckling slightly as Reverend Thomas caught her by the arm. The realization was finally slamming into them with the force of a freight train. The woman they had relentlessly mocked, the woman they had treated like a peasant, allowed to dine at the king's table, was the actual monarch. Chloe looked like she was going to be sick. She realized she had not just insulted Julian's wife. She had actively insulted the sole owner of the fund she worked for. She had brought her pregnant belly into the home of the woman who held the absolute power to terminate her career, freeze her assets, and blacklist her from the financial sector permanently. You cannot be the head of Apex. Julian stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. His entire identity, his entire sense of superiority was actively disintegrating. I am the breadwinner. I am the vice president of my firm. I am the one with the pedigree. You have a fancy title at a mediocre firm, and you are about to be indicted for federal mortgage fraud, I reminded him smoothly. I warned you earlier that your free trial had expired. I meant it. The $10 million wire transfer you were banking on has been permanently canceled. The supplementary credit cards you used to fund your fake lifestyle have been deactivated. And that little fraudulent loan you and Connor engineered, my attorneys have already forwarded the forged documents to the federal authorities. I took one final step forward, closing the distance between us. Julian looked small, terrified, and utterly defeated. Now I said, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. Pack your bags, Julian. You and your pregnant girlfriend have exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property before I have security throw you both onto the street. My fingers bypassed the phone and grasped a heavy matte black titanium card hidden in the silk lining. It was not a credit card. It was the master access key for the Apex Fund executive portal, embossed with the company's silver crest and a single initial Z Vanguard. I tossed the metal card onto the glass entryway table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that cut through the silence of the foyer. Beside it, I placed the official termination order I had drafted at 6 o'clock this morning. It bore the heavy raised stamp of the Apex corporate seal and my unredacted signature at the bottom line. "You are waiting for the final wire transfer authorization, Chloe?" I said, my voice eerily calm, resonating through the high ceilings. "I believe you were expecting an electronic confirmation from the primary investor to finalize Julian's grand illusion, but since I was already attending the party, I decided to deliver your final paperwork in person." Chloe's eyes darted from my face down to the glass table. She stared at the titanium card, her gaze tracking the silver crest, before drifting to the official termination letter. The bold black ink of my signature stared back at her. She froze. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her bright red lipstick suddenly looked like a garish, misplaced stain on white paper. Her fingers went entirely slack. The burnt orange Hermes bag slipped from her grasp, hitting the polished marble floor with a heavy final thud. Chloe took a frantic, uncoordinated step backward, her stilettos catching on the edge of the Persian rug. She stumbled, crashing hard into the edge of the glass console table. The crystal vases rattled violently as she fought to keep her balance. Her mouth fell open, and a sound of pure, unadulterated panic ripped from her throat. "No," Chloe screamed, her voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. "No, impossible. What are you doing here?" Julian frowned, deeply confused by her sudden, violent terror. He stepped forward, reaching out with both hands to steady her, his face a mask of clueless concern. "Chloe, baby, what is wrong? It is just a fake card. She is playing a game. Calm down." Chloe recoiled as if his touch was laced with acid. She violently swatted his hands away, slapping his arm with enough force to make him flinch backward. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. "You idiot!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls, raw and completely unhinged. "That is not your unemployed wife. That is Zora Vanguard, the majority shareholder of the Apex Fund, the one who signed my termination order this morning." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck all the air out of the grand foyer. Julian stopped breathing. He stared at me, then looked back at the titanium card on the table, then back at me. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, entirely incapable of processing the magnitude of the information. The woman he had spent 5 years patronizing, the woman he had relegated to the role of a financially dependent, naive housewife, was the apex predator of his corporate ecosystem. Zora Vanguard. Beatrice whispered the name, slipping from her lips like a prayer. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the back of a dining chair to keep from collapsing onto the marble. The Reverend stood frozen beside her, his righteous posturing entirely obliterated by the realization that he had just ordered a billionaire out of her own home. "You are the big boss," Julian stammered, his voice dropping to a hoarse, ragged whisper. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, his pristine tuxedo suddenly looking like a clown suit. "You are the silent investor. You are the one who approved the $10 million buy-in." "I approved the initial term sheet," I corrected smoothly, stepping closer to the glass table. "I wanted to see exactly how greedy you were. I wanted to see how far you would go to impress a woman who was only interested in my money. You spent months pitching the Apex Fund, Julian. You spent months begging for capital, submitting falsified financial projections, inflating your assets, and boasting about your brilliant brother-in-law's real estate firm." I turned my gaze to Connor, who was now clutching his chest, leaning against the wall as if he were having a heart attack. The connection had just crystallized in his mind. The $10 million he needed to cover up his federal mortgage fraud was gone. The only person who could have saved him from a federal indictment was the woman he had just mocked. "You brought Connor into your pitch," I continued, my voice lethal and precise. "You used his firm to guarantee the collateral. You leveraged this exact estate in your corporate filings to prove to the Apex Fund that you had liquid assets. You submitted a forged power of attorney directly to my risk management department." Julian was hyperventilating. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. "You knew," he gasped, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "You knew everything from the very beginning. I own the fund, Julian. Every single document you submitted crossed my desk. Every time you logged into the secure portal from your home office, I tracked the IP address. Every time you promised Chloe that you were on the verge of a massive payout, You were literally begging me for an allowance." Chloe let out another sob, sinking down against the wall, wrapping her arms around her stomach. Her corporate ambitions, her carefully calculated affair, her entire future had just been incinerated. I did not know she wept, looking up at me with terrified, pleading eyes. "I swear to God, Ms. Vanguard, I did not know she was your wife. He told me he was divorcing a nobody. He told me she was a dead weight." "And you believed him," I said, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "You broke every ethical guideline in the financial sector. You slept with a prospective client. You conspired to hide his fraudulent assets from our compliance officers. You pushed the $10 million approval through the preliminary stages because you thought you were securing a wealthy husband. You compromised my firm." I picked up the termination letter from the table and dropped it directly onto Chloe's lap. "Your termination is effective immediately," I stated, leaving no room for negotiation. "Your company's stock options are voided due to gross professional misconduct. The non-compete clause in your contract will be strictly enforced by my legal team. You will never work in corporate finance again. You threw away a brilliant career for a man who does not even own the suit he is wearing." Julian fell to his knees. The great, arrogant Julian, the man who had strutted through this party like a conquering king, was now kneeling on the marble floor of my foyer, openly weeping. "Zora, please," Julian begged, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my dress. I took a sharp step back, refusing to let him touch me. "Please, Zora, you cannot do this. We are married. I am your husband. We can fix this. I will end it with her right now. I will walk away from the deal. Just do not call the authorities. Please do not let them send me to prison." Beatrice, trying to process the absolute destruction of her son, attempted to completely flip her attitude. "Zora, dear," Beatrice stammered, stepping forward with her hands clasped in front of her chest in a grotesque display of sudden affection. The speed at which she abandoned her previous venom was dizzying. "We did not mean those things. You must understand we were simply caught up in the heat of the moment. We have always loved you like a daughter. Julian made a terrible, foolish mistake, but he is family. You have the power to fix this. You have the money to make all of these nasty legal problems disappear." I turned my gaze to Beatrice, letting the absolute coldness in my eyes freeze her in her tracks. "Do not patronize me, Beatrice. 5 minutes ago you called me a barren, vindictive woman and ordered me out of my own home. You cheered while your son paraded his pregnant mistress in front of my face. You worshipped the money you thought he was stealing. And now you want to beg for the money I rightfully own." Reverend Thomas tried to intervene, raising his hands in a gesture of peaceful mediation. "Zora, the Lord preaches forgiveness. He preaches grace in the face of transgression. Julian has strayed from the path, but with your resources, we can rehabilitate him. We can keep this quiet. Think of the family reputation. Think of the church. Your church was funded by my grandfather's trust." "Thomas," I revealed, watching the Reverend's jaw drop. "The anonymous yearly donations that kept your parish afloat for the last 5 years came directly from a subsidiary of the Apex Fund. I paid for the new roof. I paid for the stained glass windows. I financed your entire congregation while you sat at my dining table every Thanksgiving and insinuated that I was not a suitable wife for your brilliant son." The Reverend looked as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He staggered back, clutching his chest, his holy facade completely shattered by the weight of his own hypocrisy. "The funding stops today," I informed him, ensuring my voice was loud enough for every remaining guest to hear. "You can rely on the Lord to fix your roof next winter." I looked down at Julian, who was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "You are not my husband, Julian," I said, my voice echoing with chilling finality. "You are a liability, you are a criminal, and you are trespassing on my property." I pulled my phone from my hand and tapped the screen. The front doors of the mansion swung open, and 4 massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors stepped into the foyer. They were dressed in immaculate black suits, their earpieces glowing faintly in the dim light of the porch. They moved with military precision, stopping directly behind Julian and Chloe. "These gentlemen work for Vanguard Corporate Security," I announced to the silent, terrified room. "They have been waiting in the driveway for my signal. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever fits in a garbage bag. Everything else stays. The cars remain in the garage. The watches stay in the safe. You leave with the clothes on your back and the reality of what you have done. The heavy oak front doors swung open again before Julian could even formulate a pathetic response. 3 figures stepped into the foyer, moving with synchronized predatory grace. They were impeccably dressed in tailored black suits, each carrying a thick leather briefcase. They walked right past the wall of security contractors and flanked me, forming a human barricade of absolute legal authority. The ambient energy in the room seemed to physically shift, orbiting entirely around me as I stood under the glaring chandelier. I was the absolute center of gravity, and Julian was just a speck of dust caught in my pole. Julian stared at the new arrivals, his tear-streaked face contorting with fresh confusion. He planted his palms on the marble, attempting to push himself up from his knees, but a sharp warning step forward from one of my security guards kept him firmly on the floor. "You actually believed this was just about a forged mortgage, Julian?" I asked, my voice echoing through the silent house. "You honestly thought I would summon corporate security and expose my identity just to stop a single real estate transaction?" I turned slightly, gesturing to the man standing to my right. "Marcus, please enlighten my husband as to why his $10 million venture capital pitch was flagged by my internal audit team." Marcus snapped the latches of his briefcase. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick, tightly bound dossier and adjusted his glasses. He did not look at Julian with anger. He looked at him with the clinical detachment of a mortician. Julian Vanguard submitted a comprehensive prospectus to the Apex Fund 3 months ago. Marcus began, his voice projecting a crisp, undeniable authority. He requested $10 million in seed capital to launch a proprietary financial technology platform. He provided detailed quarterly projections, a roster of phantom beta testers, and claimed to have personally funded the initial $2 million research and development phase. Marcus flipped a page in the dossier, the paper crinkling loudly. However, a routine forensic trace of Mr. Vanguard's initial $2 million capital injection revealed that no technology platform actually exists. There is no software. There are no beta testers. The entire project is a complete fabrication designed to secure institutional backing. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He looked around wildly, like a trapped animal looking for an exit that did not exist. "I did build it," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The developers are offshore. The code is proprietary. You are looking at the wrong files." "You do not have any files, Julian," I stated, stepping closer to him. "The hours you spent locked in your home office pretending to be a tech visionary were actually spent doctoring your own firm's ledger. You did not raise $2 million. You embezzled it." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her face. Reverend Thomas stumbled backward, knocking into a side table, a framed photograph shattering on the floor. Marcus continued reading, completely unbothered by the family's horror. "Over the course of 14 months, Julian Vanguard systematically siphoned $2.4 million from his employer's escrow accounts. He routed the stolen capital through the same offshore shell companies he and Connor used to facilitate the fraudulent mortgage on this estate." I shifted my gaze to Chloe, who was currently pressing herself flat against the wall, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "Did you really think a mid-level vice president could afford to buy you a $5 million luxury penthouse in Midtown?" "Chloe," I asked, watching her eyes widen in absolute terror. "Did you honestly believe Julian possessed that kind of liquid wealth simply because he wore expensive suits and drove a nice car?" Chloe shook her head violently, her hands clutching her stomach. "He told me it was his bonus. He told me he cashed out his stock options to buy our home. He bought your love nest using stolen corporate funds." I corrected her, my tone merciless. "He embezzled millions from his own clients and wired it directly into a real estate trust with your name on the deed. He did not just buy you an apartment, Chloe. He made you a primary accessory to federal money laundering and corporate theft." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a scream of sorrow. It was a scream of pure, visceral self-preservation. She violently shoved Julian away, treating him like a diseased rat. She realized in a fraction of a second that her prestigious career, her flawless reputation, and her freedom were entirely gone. Julian had not just ruined his own life. He had dragged her directly into a federal indictment. "You lied to me!" Chloe shrieked, her face twisting with an ugly, vicious rage. "You told me you were rich. You told me you were a genius. You used my name on the deed to hide your stolen money. You set me up to take the fall for your embezzlement." Julian scrambled toward her on his knees, reaching out with desperate, grasping hands. "Chloe, please, you have to listen to me. I was going to put the money back. I swear to God I was going to replace it. As soon as the Apex Fund wired the $10 million, I was going to cover the shortfall in the escrow accounts. No one was ever going to know. It was just a temporary bridge loan." He was confessing out loud. He was so broken, so stripped of his arrogant facade, that he was openly admitting to his financial crimes in a room full of witnesses. He had planned to use my company's money to pay back the funds he had stolen from his own employer. He had built an elaborate multi-million-dollar house of cards, and he had expected me to unwittingly hand him the glue to hold it together. I walked a slow, deliberate circle around Julian as he continued to grovel on the floor. I looked down at the man who had spent the last 5 years calling me unambitious. I looked at the man who had allowed his mother to mock my barren womb, while he secretly funneled my resources to build a fraudulent future for another woman's child. "You are the most pathetic creature I have ever encountered, Julian," I said, bringing my walk to a halt right in front of him. "You stood in this house drinking my wine, breathing my air, and actually convinced yourself that you were a king. You thought your white-collar status made you invincible. You thought you could rob your firm, defraud a federal bank, steal from my trust, and replace your wife, all without leaving a single fingerprint." I looked over at Beatrice and the Reverend. They were clinging to each other, their faces pale and slick with cold sweat. The golden sun they had worshipped, the man they believed was destined for greatness, was nothing but a common thief staring down decades in federal prison. "You wanted me out of your brilliant life," I reminded them, echoing their own venomous words back at them. "You wanted me to clear the path so your son could achieve his destiny. Well, his destiny has arrived." In the corner of the room, Connor suddenly let out a feral, animalistic roar. The realization had finally pierced through his panic. If I had the paper trail proving Julian routed stolen money through their shared offshore shell companies, it meant my legal team had complete access to Connor's entire illegal network. Julian had not just exposed his own embezzlement. He had handed my forensic accountants the exact blueprint to Connor's fraudulent real estate empire. "You ruined me!" Connor screamed, lunging forward with his hands outstretched, aiming directly for Julian's throat. "You sloppy, arrogant idiot! You left a trail. You dragged my firm into your pathetic embezzlement scheme." Before Connor could lay a hand on Julian, 2 of my security contractors stepped forward, intercepting him with brutal efficiency. They slammed Connor against the marble wall, pinning his arms behind his back. The heavy thud of his body hitting the stone echoed like a final gavel strike. The Vanguard family was officially tearing itself apart. The immaculate, untouchable facade they had presented to the world was burning to the ground, and they were the ones throwing the gasoline. The chaotic symphony of Connor screaming and Julian sobbing against the marble floor was suddenly interrupted by a booming, authoritative voice. Reverend Thomas had stepped away from his trembling wife. His shoulders squared, his chest puffed out in a desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, his face contorting into a mask of righteous indignation. He was a man accustomed to commanding rooms from a pulpit, a man who believed his title granted him immunity from the consequences of the real world. "Zora, that is enough!" The Reverend bellowed, his voice vibrating with a practiced theatrical fury. "You have made your point. You have humiliated my son. You have unleashed your wrath upon this household. But I will not stand here and allow you to destroy my family out of sheer malice. The Lord warns us against the poison of vengeance. You are acting out of spite, tearing down everything we have built simply because you are hurt. I demand that you call off these men. I demand that you stop this spectacle immediately before you do irreparable damage to our reputation and to the sanctity of our church." I slowly turned my head to look at him. The sheer audacity of his demand was almost impressive. He stood there wrapped in a cloak of false piety, attempting to use the name of God to shield his son from a federal indictment. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply held out my left hand toward Marcus. Without breaking eye contact with the Reverend Marcus, opened a secondary compartment in his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila folder, the edges reinforced with red tape, and placed it firmly into my waiting hand. The heavy physical weight of the file was immensely satisfying. I walked toward Reverend Thomas, my heels striking the marble with rhythmic, unhurried precision. He stood his ground, lifting his chin, trying to project the image of an untouchable holy man facing down a sinner. I stopped less than 2 feet away from him. I raised the manila folder and slammed it down onto the glass surface of the console table with a sharp, violent crack. The sound made the Reverend flinch. "You want to speak to me about sanctity, Thomas?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Quiet register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath just to hear me. "You want to lecture me about morality while standing in the wreckage of your own greed." I flipped the folder open. Dozens of heavily redacted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and internal audit reports spilled out across the glass. They were printed on official Apex Fund stationery, bearing the unmistakable watermark of a certified financial autopsy. My internal audit team did not just trace the money Julian stole from his employer, I explained, tapping a manicured finger against the top document. When we dismantled Julian's offshore shell company, the one he created for his imaginary tech platform, we found a very interesting secondary stream of income. Someone else had bought into his brilliant illusion. Someone had wired exactly $500,000 into that fraudulent account just 3 weeks ago. Beatrice let out a confused, wet gasp. She looked from the papers on the table up to her husband. "Thomas, what is she talking about?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. The Reverend did not answer his wife. His face had gone completely gray. The rigid, pious posture he had maintained for decades dissolved in a matter of seconds. His mouth opened, but his booming preacher's voice completely failed him. I picked up the top bank statement and held it up so the harsh light of the chandelier illuminated the bold black text. "This is a certified ledger from the First Congregational Parish Relief Fund," I read aloud, enunciating every single syllable with brutal clarity. "This is the emergency community account. The money your congregation raised over the last 2 years to build the new youth center. The money meant for the homeless shelter. The money meant to support families in your community who cannot afford to feed their children." I dropped the paper back onto the table and took a step closer to the Reverend, invading his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. "On the 14th of last month, you personally authorized a withdrawal of $500,000 from that charity fund." Thomas Thigh stated the facts, hanging in the air like a guillotine. "You wired the money directly to Julian's offshore account. You stole $500,000 from orphans and widows because your son promised you a 40% return on investment in 30 days. You threw the church's money into a fraudulent tech startup, hoping to quietly skim the profits for yourself before anyone noticed the principal was missing." Beatrice let out a horrifying, guttural scream. It was not a scream of sorrow. It was the sound of her entire universe, her entire identity violently imploding. She lunged forward, grabbing her husband by the lapels of his suit, shaking him with a sudden, frantic strength. "Tell me she is lying!" Beatrice shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Thomas, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not touch the relief fund. The church board is auditing the accounts next week. If that money is gone, we are ruined. We will be excommunicated." Thomas could not look at his wife. He looked down at his polished Italian leather shoes, his hands trembling at his sides. "I had to do it, Beatrice." He mumbled, his voice a pathetic broken whine. "Julian said it was guaranteed. He showed me the projections. He said the Apex Fund was backing the technology. I was going to put the principal back before the audit. I was going to use the profits to pay off our second mortgage. The church was never going to know." "You absolute fool!" Beatrice wailed, slapping his chest with her open palms. "You stole from the church. You trusted this idiot boy and you stole from the church. We are going to prison. I watched the impeccable superior vanguard parents tear each other apart. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Just minutes ago, Beatrice had called me a peasant. She had told me to pack my cheap belongings and crawl back to obscurity. She had proudly announced that she belonged to a different stratosphere of wealth and pedigree. You were right about one thing, Beatrice, I said smoothly, cutting through her hysterical sobbing. You and your husband truly are operating on the exact same level as your son. You are all a family of desperate, greedy thieves hiding behind designer labels and religious titles. You spent 5 years looking down your nose at me because I grew organic vegetables and chose not to flaunt my bank account. You thought my silence was weakness. You thought my patience was stupidity. I turned back to Marcus, who was already holding a secondary stack of legal notices. The Apex Fund Forensic Accounting Division is legally obligated to report any discovery of federal wire fraud and embezzlement, I announced to the room. My attorneys have already forwarded the complete paper trail, including the parish bank statements, directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Regional Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The authorities will be freezing the church accounts by tomorrow morning. They will be seizing your assets, Thomas. They will be taking the house you falsely remortgaged. Reverend Thomas fell back against the wall, clutching his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked at Julian, who was still pinned to the floor by the sheer weight of his own destruction. The father and son stared at each other, no longer a proud patriarch and his golden boy, but two criminals, realizing they were both going down in flames. Chloe was still backed into the corner, weeping into her hands, completely ignored by the family she had so desperately tried to marry into. Connor was still being held against the marble wall by my security team, his face bruised and furious. I picked up my glass of dark red wine from the tray where I had left it. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the absolute silence that had finally descended upon my home. The toxic, suffocating infection that had plagued my life for 5 years was finally being surgically removed. My security team will escort you all to the driveway, I commanded, setting the empty wine glass down next to the evidence of their crimes. You are no longer welcome on my property. You are no longer welcome in my life. You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I have you thrown out. The two security contractors holding Connor pinned against the cold marble wall suddenly released their grip. Connor stumbled forward, his heavy breathing filling the space left by Julian's pathetic whimpers. He aggressively straightened the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, shooting a venomous glare at his brother-in-law weeping on the floor. Connor was a survivor. He possessed the predatory instincts of a corrupt real estate developer who had spent his entire career slipping through legal loopholes. He realized instantly that the Vanguard family ship was sinking rapidly, and he had absolutely no intention of drowning with them. He pulled his phone from his inner breast pocket, his thumb rapidly swiping across the glowing screen. He did not look at me. He did not look at his wife, Gabrielle, who was currently clutching her pearl necklace in silent horror. He simply turned on his heel and began walking briskly toward the heavy double doors leading to the side courtyard. I gave Marcus a subtle, nearly imperceptible nod. Marcus raised 2 fingers. The largest of the security contractors, a man who looked like he was carved entirely from granite, stepped fluidly across the foyer. He planted his massive frame directly in front of the side exit, folding his arms across his chest. He resembled a brick wall in a tuxedo. Connor stopped short, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. He looked up at the guard, a muscle ticking in his jaw, before turning slowly back to face me. "You cannot hold me here. Zora," Connor stated, his voice dripping with forced bravado and arrogant entitlement. "I am not part of Julian's psychotic corporate embezzlement fantasy. I am an independent broker. You blocking my exit constitutes illegal detainment and false imprisonment. Step aside right now, or I will have my personal legal counsel tear you and your precious fund apart." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that offered absolutely no warmth. "I highly doubt that, Connor," I replied, my voice slicing through the tense air. "Your lead corporate counsel submitted his formal resignation via email exactly 20 minutes ago. It seems he suddenly realized that advising a client actively engaging in federal mortgage fraud might jeopardize his license to practice law." Connor froze. The smug, superior sneer evaporated from his face, replaced by a rigid mask of sudden panic. He stared at me, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his phone. "You are bluffing. My firm is fully insulated from Julian. You have nothing on me." I held my hand out toward Marcus once again. My chief auditor did not even need to search his briefcase. He already held a slender red-bordered file in his hands. He passed it to me with the precision of a surgeon handing over a scalpel. "You have always prided yourself on being the smartest man in the room, Connor," I said, tapping the stiff cardboard of the file. "You spent every family holiday boasting about your brilliant real estate acquisitions. You loved mocking my organic farming. You loved telling Julian that he needed to assert his dominance over a simple-minded woman like me. But you were not as insulated as you thought. You were bleeding cash." Connor swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto the red file in my hands. "Horizon Estates has been operating at a massive, unsustainable deficit for the last 3 years." I continued, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the grand foyer. "Your commercial properties were sitting empty. Your creditors were threatening to call in your loans. You were desperate. So when your idiot brother-in-law approached you with a stolen $2 million capital injection from his fake tech startup, you saw a lifeline." Gabrielle, who had been standing frozen near the dining room entrance, took a shaky step forward. Her eyes darted from her husband to me, her face pale with rising terror. "Connor, what is she talking about?" Gabrielle whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Tell her she is crazy. Tell her our firm is fine." Connor ignored his wife. He kept his eyes entirely fixed on me, a desperate cornered glint shining in his pupils. "I did not touch Julian's stolen money." Connor spat, his voice rising in pitch. "You cannot prove anything." I opened the red file. "I do not need to prove that you touched Julian's money, Connor. I need to prove that you collateralized your toxic underwater properties using forged signatures. When you realized you were going bankrupt, you issued millions of dollars in junk bonds to keep your company afloat. You packaged your worthless commercial debt and sold it on the secondary market to hide your insolvency." Connor let out a harsh, barking laugh, attempting to project confidence he clearly no longer possessed. "Buying and selling high-yield debt is a standard market practice, Zora. It is not illegal to issue bonds. You clearly do not understand how corporate real estate works." "I understand exactly how it works," I shot back, snapping the file shut with a sharp crack. "I understand it so well that 6 months ago I directed the Vanguard Logistics and Acquisition Fund to systematically purchase every single piece of high-yield debt your company issued. I bought it all, Connor. Every junk bond, every leveraged asset, every toxic commercial loan you desperately dumped onto the market. I bought it through a dozen anonymous proxy firms." Connor stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked sickly translucent. He staggered backward, his shoulder hitting the wall as his legs momentarily gave out. "I own your debt, Connor," I stated, stepping forward, until I was standing directly in his line of sight. "I am the primary majority creditor of Horizon Estates. I own the mortgages on your commercial strip malls. I own the loans on your empty office buildings. And most importantly, I own the secondary mortgage on your $6 million primary residence." He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped. His entire real estate empire, the foundation of his immense arrogance and abusive superiority, had just been ripped out from under him. "You violated the core covenants of your bond issuances the moment you submitted falsified property appraisals to secure the loans." I explained, my tone strictly business. "Fraud immediately accelerates the debt. I am officially calling in every single bond. I am calling in every loan. You are completely, irreversibly bankrupt." "You cannot do this!" Connor yelled, a spray of saliva flying from his lips. He lunged forward, but the security guard instantly shoved him back against the wall with brutal force. "You vindictive witch! You cannot liquidate my company overnight. I will drag you through bankruptcy court for a decade. I will tie your fund up in endless litigation. You will not have the time or the resources to litigate anything, Connor," I replied, checking the heavy silver watch on my wrist. "I did not just freeze your accounts and buy your toxic debt. I had my forensic team compile a comprehensive dossier of every forged signature, every inflated appraisal, and every illegal wire transfer you executed alongside Julian. Connor went completely still, his eyes wide and unblinking. I digitized the entire portfolio, I announced, letting the absolute finality of my words sink into his bones. And exactly 3 hours ago, my legal team handed that comprehensive digital file directly to the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Beatrice began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face against Reverend Thomas's chest. They are not just looking at a civil bankruptcy, Connor. They are looking at federal racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Agent Miller is likely sitting at his desk right now, drafting the arrest warrants for you and your brother-in-law. You will not be fighting me in civil court. You will be fighting the federal government to stay out of a maximum security penitentiary. A piercing, agonizing scream shattered the remaining silence. Gabrielle broke away from the dining room archway and stumbled into the center of the foyer. Her perfect manicured facade was completely obliterated. She stared at Connor with absolute horrified realization. The private country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, the lavish vacations she had flaunted in my face for years, were all funded by a massive criminal fraud. "You ruined us!" Gabrielle shrieked, her voice tearing at the vocal cords. She launched herself at Connor, her fists raining down on his chest and shoulders. "You lied to me. You told me we were fine. You told me Julian's deal was going to make us billions. You lost our house. You lost my children's trust funds. You are going to prison." "Shut up!" Gabrielle Connor roared, trying to grab her wrists and push her away. "Stop acting like a hysterical child." Gabrielle tore herself from his grip. She looked around the grand foyer, looking at Julian weeping on the floor, looking at her parents paralyzed with terror, looking at the security guards blocking every exit. Her pristine superior reality had collapsed. The Vanguard family was utterly destroyed. Gabrielle let out a final broken sob. Her knees gave out completely. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor, right next to her brother, burying her face in her hands and weeping hysterically. The sound of her profound despair mingled with Julian's ragged breathing, creating a pathetic chorus of absolute ruin. I stood perfectly still, watching the people who had tried to destroy me drown in the consequences of their own actions. The chaotic symphony of Gabrielle's wails and Connor's furious, muted cursing filled the grand foyer. Chloe remained backed into the corner, her eyes darting frantically across the room. She looked at the federal evidence stacked on the glass table. She looked at the unyielding wall of corporate security guards blocking the exits. Then she looked at Julian. The man who had promised her the world was currently a pathetic, sniveling mess on the marble floor, stripped of his fake wealth and facing a lengthy prison sentence. Her survival instinct kicked in with ruthless efficiency. The calculated ambition that had driven her to sleep with a client instantly morphed into desperate self-preservation. Chloe pushed herself away from the wall. She staggered forward, her heels clicking erratically on the stone, and threw herself to her knees directly at my feet. She shoved Julian aside in the process, knocking him off balance. "Zora, please!" Chloe begged, her voice cracking as fresh theatrical tears spilled over her eyelashes. "You have to listen to me. I am a victim in this too." Julian gasped, his head snapping up to stare at his mistress in absolute shock. "Chloe, what are you doing?" "Shut your mouth!" Chloe shrieked, shooting him a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She turned her pleading, tear-streaked face back to me, clasping her hands together in a desperate prayer. "Ms. Vanguard, he lied to me. He manipulated me from the very beginning. He told me he was a senior managing partner. He told me he controlled the Vanguard family fortune. He threatened to have me blacklisted from the financial sector if I did not push his portfolio through the preliminary approval stages." Julian stared at her, his jaw dropping. "You told me you loved me." He choked out, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You said we were going to build an empire together. You are a monster!" Chloe screamed at him, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandelier. "You are a thief and a liar!" She scrambled closer to me, reaching out to grab the hem of my silk dress. My security guard immediately took a threatening step forward, but I raised a single hand holding him back. I wanted to hear every desperate word. "Zora, Please, you have to understand. Chloe wept, staring up at me with wide, panicked eyes. I was terrified of him. He is a predator, and now I am pregnant. I am carrying a child. He took advantage of a vulnerable pregnant woman. Please do not destroy my career. I will do whatever you want. I will testify against him in federal court. I will give your auditors his private passwords. I will hand over the encryption keys to his offshore accounts. Just spare me. I only did it because I was scared for my baby. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the spectacular wreckage of their romance. 10 minutes ago, they were the untouchable power couple, ready to rule the corporate world. Now they were viciously trying to feed each other to the wolves, just to save their own skin. I offered Chloe a slow, chilling smirk. Pregnant, I asked, letting the single word hang heavily in the cold air of the foyer. I slowly shifted my gaze from the groveling mistress on the floor and locked eyes with my completely broken husband. Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we never had children during our 5 years of marriage? Julian stared at me, his tear-streaked face twisting in absolute bewilderment. He looked from Chloe's stomach back to my eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I reached into Marcus's briefcase one final time. I pulled out a slender white envelope from the side pocket and tossed it onto the glass table, landing perfectly on top of the federal embezzlement files. That is a certified medical evaluation from Massachusetts General Hospital, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Dated 4 years ago. You have severe congenital azoospermia, Julian. You are completely and permanently sterile. You could not father a child if your life depended on it. Julian froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. That is a lie, he whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic denial. We were still trying. The doctor said we just needed more time. It is a clinical, indisputable fact, I corrected mercilessly. I intercepted the test results before you ever saw the actual data. I paid the clinic to seal the official records and feed you a false narrative of hope. I sat at Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and Easter brunches for 5 years, silently listening to your mother mock my empty, barren womb. I let this entire arrogant family treat me like defective goods, all to protect your unbelievably fragile, pathetic ego. I absorbed their endless cruelty so you could still look in the mirror and feel like a man. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp in the corner. Her hands flew to her mouth as the crushing weight of her own past insults finally crashed down on her. I turned my attention back down to Chloe, who was now trembling so violently her teeth chattered. Julian cannot give you a child, Chloe, I said smoothly, stepping back to give the room a clear view of the disaster. So the question remains, who exactly is the father of this miracle baby? The realization hit Julian like a runaway freight train. The illusion of his perfect devoted mistress, the woman he had stolen millions to impress, shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a feral, guttural roar that did not even sound human. He scrambled up from the marble floor and lunged directly at Chloe. His hands closed around her throat before anyone could even react. He slammed her back against the expensive wallpaper, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute, unhinged madness. "Who is it?" Julian screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he shook her violently against the plaster. "Who is the father? Tell me right now." Chloe clawed frantically at his wrists, her face turning a mottled, terrifying shade of red. She gasped for air, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for a savior who was definitely not coming to her rescue. "Tell me!" Julian roared again, tightening his grip. "It is Connor!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through the room like a jagged knife. "It is Connor's baby!" The silence that followed was absolute, deafening, and completely suffocating. It lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the entire house violently exploded. Gabrielle, who had just stopped weeping over her husband's impending federal indictment, let out a sound that chilled the blood in my veins. She turned her head slowly, looking at Connor, who was still pinned against the opposite wall by my security. Her own husband, the man who had bankrupted their family, and apparently the man who had been sleeping with her brother's mistress. "You disgusting bastard," Gabrielle screamed, launching herself across the grand foyer. She did not go for his clothes. She went straight for his face. Her perfectly manicured nails dug deeply into his cheeks as she tackled him to the floor. Connor shouted in pain, trying to throw her off, but Gabrielle fought with the deranged animalistic strength of a woman who had just lost her wealth, her pristine reputation, and her marriage in the span of 20 minutes. My security guards took a synchronized step back, seamlessly forming a perimeter and allowing the Vanguard family to physically tear each other apart on the imported marble. Reverend Thomas was shouting useless, panicked prayers into the air. Beatrice was hyperventilating on the floor, and Julian collapsed back into a sobbing heap over the mistress who had betrayed him with his own brother-in-law. The destruction was finally absolute. The shrill, piercing wail of sirens suddenly cut through the violent sounds of the Vanguard family tearing themselves apart. A second later, the grand windows of the foyer were illuminated by the frantic, pulsing sweep of red and blue lights. The heavy strobes painted the marble floors and the crystal chandelier in alternating colors of absolute panic. The federal authorities had not waited until morning. They had arrived right on cue. The flashing lights seemed to shock Julian out of his murderous, heartbroken trance. He dropped his hands from Chloe, scrambling backward across the floor like a terrified child fleeing a nightmare. He looked at the heavy oak doors, then turned his bloodshot eyes up to me. The realization that his life of tailored suits and corporate prestige was officially over hit him with the force of a physical blow. He did not try to run or fight. Instead, he crawled toward me on his hands and knees, his expensive trousers sliding against the polished stone. He threw himself at my feet, his hands desperately grabbing at my ankles. "Zora, please, Julian," begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched hysterical sob. "You cannot let them take me. We have been together for 10 years. You know me. You know my heart. I made a mistake, but I am still your husband. Please call off your lawyers. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will sign whatever you want. I will walk away with absolutely nothing. Just do not let them put me in a cage. You know what happens to a black man in the federal system. I will not survive in there, Zora. I will die in prison. Please, you cannot do this to me." I looked down at his trembling, pathetic form. I felt absolutely no pity, no lingering affection, and certainly no remorse. I slowly and deliberately pulled my foot back, forcing his grasping hands to slip off my skin and hit the cold floor. "You are not a victim of the system, Julian," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are a victim of your own greed. You built this cage with your own 2 hands, and now you are going to sit in it." The heavy oak doors were violently pushed open from the outside. My security team seamlessly stepped back, creating a wide, unobstructed path as a dozen federal agents and uniformed police officers flooded into the grand foyer. The chaotic energy in the room instantly crystallized into cold, procedural authority. Agent Miller, a tall, imposing man in a dark windbreaker, stepped forward, a thick stack of warrants in his hand. He did not hesitate. He pointed directly at the 3 men who had spent years acting like gods among mortals. Julian Vanguard, Connor Hayes, and Thomas Vanguard. The agent announced, his voice echoing over the continuing wail of the sirens outside. "You are all under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, and money laundering." Officers swarmed them immediately. Connor tried to struggle, screaming obscenities at his wife and his brother-in-law as they forced his arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs. Reverend Thomas offered no resistance whatsoever. He simply hung his head in absolute shame, weeping silently as an agent read him his Miranda rights. Julian remained on his knees, sobbing my name over and over again as he was hauled roughly to his feet and cuffed. Beatrice stood frozen, watching the officers drag her golden son and her supposedly holy husband toward the door. The pristine, untouchable legacy she had spent her entire life cultivating was being marched out of my house in federal chains. She let out a single breathless gasp, her eyes rolling into the back of her head, and collapsed in a dead faint, hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud. I did not offer a single hand to help Beatrice up from the floor. I simply stepped over her unconscious body and signaled to the lead security contractor standing near the grand staircase. Pack every single thing that belongs to them. I ordered, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. Every custom suit, every pair of imported shoes, every golf club, and every piece of jewelry Julian purchased using stolen funds. Shove it all into industrial garbage bags and dump it at the end of the driveway. I want this entire estate scrubbed completely clean of the Vanguard infection before midnight. My contractors moved with ruthless efficiency. Gabrielle and Chloe were practically dragged out the front doors, their hysterical competing screams fading into the cool night air. Paramedics eventually arrived to revive Beatrice from the marble floor, only to immediately load the disgraced matriarch into an ambulance under strict police supervision. I walked out onto this grand stone portico of my home, the crisp, clean evening breeze washing over my face. I stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, my posture perfect and unyielding. I watched in deep satisfaction as the synchronized procession of federal vehicles rolled down my long, winding driveway. The harsh, flashing red and blue lights illuminated my pristine landscaping, carrying away the arrogant men who had spent half a decade trying to convince me I was worthless. They were locked in the back of federal transport vans, permanently stripped of their stolen wealth, their false prestige, and their freedom. The heavy oak doors finally closed behind me, sealing out the chaos of the world and leaving me in absolute glorious silence. I sit here now in the quiet, untouched comfort of my living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. I look at the heavy crystal glass of aged bourbon resting in my hand, the amber liquid catching the warm golden light of the room. I take one final slow sip, savoring the smooth, rich burn against my throat, and set the glass down firmly on the mahogany table. Society spends a phenomenal amount of time teaching women how to endure. We are conditioned from birth to swallow our pride, to shrink our ambitions, and to suffer in polite silence just to protect the fragile egos of the men around us. We are repeatedly told that keeping the peace is a virtue, even when that peace is built entirely upon our own degradation and financial ruin. But endless endurance is not a badge of honor when it requires sacrificing your own soul. The true measure of a woman does not lie in how much abuse she can quietly tolerate to maintain the illusion of a flawless marriage. Her true power lies in her absolute unforgiving clarity. It lies in knowing the exact moment to stand up, stop playing by their rigged rules, sweep every single piece off the board, and force the traitors to pay back every last cent. I did not just defeat the Vanguard family. I completely erased them. And I did it using the exact same brilliance they spent 5 years trying to bury. The screen fades to absolute black.